Dr. Caroline Zickgraf. She's joining us from Brussels and is a migration specialist and the Deputy Director of the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liege. Dr. Zickgraf, thanks for being with us. Now, do you think that enough of us are aware enough just how much the climate crisis is going to affect where we live?
Absolutely not. I think that we are far from where we need to be in terms of recognizing the impact of climate change on our population landscapes, where we live, how we live, who moves, and where. I think that for the moment, we've only a drop in the bucket in terms of actually acknowledging the issue.
Now, with these kind of stories, we often think that it's going to be the developing world, the global south, as that people might want to call it, that are going to be most affected. And we know about Bangladesh and it being low-lying and what rising water levels affecting them. But it's not just places in the developing part of the world. Megacities on the eastern seaboard will be affected by rising water, won't they?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, developing countries are for the moment the most affected and the most vulnerable to climatic change. However, what we're seeing is it doesn't discriminate between developing and developing countries in terms of actual impacts. So you look at the United States, you look at disasters and sudden onset events like hurricanes and hurricane seasons. This is equally an issue for Europe and for the United States and developed nations as it is for developing nations. The question is a matter of who has the ability to adapt and is able to keep their populations in place.
And how does that adaptation work? I mean, a country like Bangladesh, which is so low-lying, or desert countries that are around the equator, it's really difficult for them to adapt. I can't really think of many mitigating things that can be done apart from mass migration that can actually try and keep those countries habitable in the future, if the future is as bad as we all think it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, of course, mitigation is one option. Mitigating what our greenhouse gas emissions and making sure that we don't have a severe increase in global temperatures in the future. However, adaptation is really what we have to look at to address what's happening today. Migration is not a future threat. It's something that's happening right now. And adapting may mean adapting in places of origin, in places like Bangladesh, but in the many other countries that are affected by climatic change. Adapting our crops, adapting agriculture. As you've seen, agriculture is one of the main links between climate change and migration. 60 to 70% of sub-Saharan Africa depends directly on what happens to the environment. But we also have to think that migration can also be adaptation. So we can't all put all of our eggs in the basket of adapting in situ. We also have to think about how migration can be a positive form of adaptation to climate change for many of the world's populations.
And just take us through how there can be positive elements to that migration. Is it the fact that people can move to cities and get better jobs?
Yes, well, climate migration is often motivated by many of the same things that other forms of migration are motivated by: better opportunities, better livelihoods, more security. And so when migration out of an environmentally vulnerable place happens, and it's done so by choice, in a safe way, in a regular way, and destinations are prepared for that migration, people can have more stable livelihoods. They can help their communities of origin, but they also are just physically in a better place, more secure when, again, that is prepared for and the infrastructure is in place to accommodate them.
You talked a little bit about sort of food security and the growing of crop agriculture more broadly. I've sort of read a lot of these kind of moonshot ideas of trying to make sure that you can keep growing crops in certain places that are getting drier and hotter all the time. Are any of those, in your mind, going to stand up to scrutiny in the next couple of decades? Will any of those plans, those big plans, actually work?
Well, I think that it depends on the place. I'm an academic, so I have to say that context matters. It depends what crops we're talking about and what environmental conditions we're talking about. I think the key here is to be flexible, to make sure that our solutions aren't based on some fixed idea of what the world should look like, but rather are adapting to new realities and responding. So if that means changing crops and making sure that we do so with the people who are actually responsible and dependent on those crops, and making sure that their insights are known, not just top-down approaches to addressing this issue in which we dictate solutions to the people who know better than any of us what is required to sustain livelihoods.
And finally then, Dr. Zickgraf, in terms of policy makers, we've got a new administration in the United States. They're saying they're going to rejoin the Paris Agreement, and we're looking forward to COP26, I think it's going to be coming up this year. Is enough being discussed at that level about the impacts of global migration caused by climate change, do you think?
It's certainly being discussed, I think, primarily in terms of displacement, the forced migration aspects. You have the task force on displacement, which was created by the Paris Agreement. And so we're looking forward to seeing how COP26 addresses these issues in their complexity. So addressing displacement, addressing also more voluntary adaptive forms of migration. Certainly, Biden's executive order is a step in the right direction, and one that is extremely welcomed by the international community, to put not just climate change back on the United States agenda and climate diplomacy, but putting migration and people who are the most affected and the most vulnerable back in the spotlight.
Absolutely. Okay, we have to leave it there. Dr. Caroline Zickgraf from the University of Liege in Belgium. Appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.